A half ago, in the mid-1990s, I found myself in a room with two men who had lived firsthand through Trotskyism in the 1930s. One was my friend David Weiss, and the other was Albert Glotzer. In background, the two men were remarkably similar. David was born in 1911 to a working-class Jewish family in Warsaw and came to the United States when he was 3. Glotzer was born to a working-class Jewish family in Pinsk in 1908. The Bolshevik Revolution took place on his 9th birthday, and came to the United States when he was 4. Both had been in the Young Communist League as teenagers. Both had early on embraced Trotskyism. Glotzer was among the first expelled from the Communist Party with Cannon and Shachtman in 1928, and David had joined the Communist League of America in 1932 with his brother Murray, who later became one of the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party. Despite being old comrades with very similar cultural backgrounds, their political trajectories had deviated widely. Glotzer had followed Shachtman all the way to the extreme right of American social democracy. David, having been expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party in the Great Barnside Purge of 1983, still continued to think of himself as a Trotskyist and revolutionary Marxist until his dying day. He lived another decade after that, by the way. At the time, he was a loyal but not terribly enthusiastic member of Socialist Action. The root of this split between these two men went back to 1939-40. So it was fascinating to watch how heated both men became when the topic of this split came up. Although David was supposed to be a neutral interviewer, I was the cameraman, and David was interviewing him for a movie he was making about Trotsky. Glotzer had been one of Trotsky's bodyguards at Printkapo in Turkey. He found himself obliged to defend Cannonite positions against the Shachtmanite Glotzer. All the way back to Brooklyn on the subway, David was fuming at Glotzer. At one level, I found this very funny, a Marxist version of grumpy old men, the difference being that instead of Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon fighting over Anne Margaret, David and Glotzer were fighting over the question of the defense of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union no longer existed then. Do these obscure old struggles matter anymore in a radically different world? I think that they do, not because we have to deal with the same problems, but rather because how one thinks about old problems affects how one thinks about new ones that are often disguised and recombined versions of old ones. So the period we're now dealing with can be subdivided into the following 4 periods. 1939, I actually begin slightly before the death of Trotsky. 1939 to 1941, the period of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. 1941 to 1945, the period of World War II and the anti-fascist alliance. Of course, World War II began before that, but I'm thinking of the Soviet Union and World War II. And then the third period is about 1945 to 1948 or thereabouts. It doesn't have an exact turning point, which is a transitional period. And finally, from the beginning of the Cold War to the death of Stalin and the split of the Fourth International, are more or less the period 1948 to 1953 or 47, 49. The exact dates don't matter. Each of these periods, like the 3 periods of the period 1919 to 1933, has a different character and needs to be examined separately. The overall theme which characterizes all 4 of these periods, however, is the relationship of democracy to socialism. Whereas in the 1920s, the essential issues around which the left opposition had formed were a defense of internationalism against nationalism, against a parochial view limited to the Soviet Union. In the problems of the 1940s and 1950s, nationalism took a back seat. Unlike the interwar period, which had been characterized by intense nationalism, the post-war period seemed to be characterized by rival internationalisms, a bourgeois internationalism in the West and a Stalinist internationalism in the East. Even the crusade against Hitler, in which the Soviet Union and the Western democracies were allied against the rabid ultranationalism of Nazi Germany, had an internationalist character. The United Nations, the epitome of post-war liberal internationalism, was born in this struggle. But on the other hand, so on the one hand, the Allies seemed to represent the Enlightenment against the rabid counter-Enlightenment of Nazi Germany and fascism. So both imperialist bourgeois democracy and Stalinism, for all of their obvious problems, had some kind of Enlightenment legacy which they represented. But on the other hand, even Nazi Germany presented its war aims as a defense of European civilization against the Judeo-Bolshevik bacillus, which was a kind of internationalism of the radical right. And not since the end of the wars of religion in the 17th century had Europeans seemed so divided by ideas, not by nationality fundamentally, but by ideas. Now, in the first period, 1939 to 1941, the dominant problem was that after the apparent volte-face of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Soviet Union no longer seemed the linchpin of European anti-fascism, as it had seemed during the Popular Front period, but almost an ally of Nazi Germany. Immediately, many liberals who had hitherto overlooked certain shortfalls in the Soviet Union because of its anti-fascist role began to notice the similarities between the two societies. And that's obviously the backdrop for the Shachtman canon split. With the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union, however, the Popular Front alliance between liberalism and Stalinism was revived with a vengeance. World War II clearly had a different character for Marxists from World War I. Of all Marxist tendencies, the Trotskyists were the ones who had the most difficulty with it theoretically. So unlike the Stalinists and the Social Democrats, who straightforwardly sided with the Allies, the Trotskyists insisted that the British and American war against Nazi Germany was just as imperialist as the British and American war had been in its war against the Kaiser's Germany. That both Nazi Germany and Britain and the United States were imperialist powers. But at the same time that they were opposed to their own bourgeoisie, they clearly had a side in the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the problem was that the Soviet Union was allied with one set of imperialist powers against another, and was furthermore receiving vital aid from these powers. In addition, there was the awkward fact that only under bourgeois democracy, i.e. in imperialist powers like the United States and Britain, could Trotskyism exist. Under both fascist and Stalinist rule, Trotskyists were murdered and sent to concentration camps.
Sorry.
Continue?
Mm-hmm.
Thus, despite theoretically characterizing the American and British war efforts as imperialist and being opposed, at least to certain aspects, as opposed to World War II, so Cannon spent time in prison under the Smith Act for this position, the Trotskyists were really the only people prosecuted under the Smith Act before the war. And this prosecution was supported by the Communist Party. It's an interesting story. But aside from that, no Trotskyist on the planet was indifferent to the horror of an Axis victory. Furthermore, in addition to the theoretical problem raised by rooting for the Soviet Union in the East, but denouncing the Soviet Union's allies as imperialist, and the desirability in practice of bourgeois democracy for Trotskyism, there was the fate of Trotskyists who found themselves in fascist-ruled Europe. Obviously, Trotskyists sympathized with the struggles of workers in occupied countries against fascist super-exploitation, and with the struggle of oppressed nations like Poles and Jews against the German occupier. There were, for example, Trotskyists in the Warsaw Ghetto. The vast majority of Polish Trotskyists, in fact, appear to have been Jews, and clearly Polish-Jewish Trotskyists in the Warsaw Ghetto were not going to be neutral vis-a-vis the Nazis, whatever theoretical position there might have been about the war being an imperialist war. Nevertheless, all of these resistance movements posed theoretical problems for Trotskyist internationalism. Thus, the French resistance had a strongly nationalist character, whereas Trotskyists had a perspective of trying to win over German soldiers in the occupying army to an anti-Nazi Marxist revolutionary perspective. The Polish resistance, for example, was split between a right-wing Polish nationalist movement and a pro-Stalinist one. Throughout Europe, resistance to the Nazis was led either by non- and anti-communist nationalists or by Stalinists. The leadership of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example, was predominantly Zionist, although communists played a role in that too. What did not exist anywhere in Europe was a perspective for international workers' revolution against fascism. A few quixotic attempts were made by Trotskyists in this direction. So German exiled Trotskyists had published a newspaper in German, Arbeiter und Soldat, and French Trotskyists tried to distribute this newspaper in occupied France, and the newspaper was calling on German soldiers to overthrow the Second Reich the same way that their fathers had overthrown the Second Reich in 1918. A lot of these Trotskyists were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to concentration camps, who were trying to distribute. It didn't seem to have any effect on the German occupation army. Now, since the Nazi genocide of the Jews has acquired an iconic status in thinking about World War II and the crimes of fascism, a few remarks about the response of Trotskyists to what is now called the Holocaust or the Shoah are in order. Although the Nazi assault on the Jews did not pose the theoretical challenges to Trotskyists that Stalinism posed, it did show, perhaps in a subtler way, some of the ideological limitations of Trotskyism. But first of all, let me say that Trotsky's record on warning about the nature of Nazism and anti-Semitism was excellent. So Trotsky would write, for example, quoting Trotsky, "Before exhausting or drowning mankind in blood, capitalism befouls the world atmosphere with the poisonous vapors of national and race hatred. Anti-Semitism today is one of the most malignant convulsions of capitalism's death agony. An uncompromising disclosure of the roots of race prejudice and all forms and shades of national arrogance and chauvinism, particularly anti-Semitism, should become part of the daily work of all sections of the Fourth International as the most important part of the struggle against imperialism and war. Our basic slogan remains, 'Workers of the world unite.' And indeed, one of the points on which the Fourth International in this period can be proudest is that one cannot find the slightest hint of any accommodation to anti-Semitism or any other form of racism or national chauvinism." Furthermore, Trotsky was one of the two people I know who came closest to predicting the Holocaust before World War II. The other, rather ironically, being the right-wing Zionist Jabotinsky. Both correctly and tragically opined that the next European war would mean the deaths of millions of Jews, although the political conclusions they drew from this were quite different: a Jewish state in Palestine versus world socialist revolution. In addition, despite what was a standard Marxist hostility towards any form of Jewish particularism, so Trotsky was opposed to both Bundism and Zionism, although Trotskyists in Poland did during the French turn enter the Bund, Trotsky and Trotskyism have often carried for many people an association with Jewishness. Almost always, this association has been anti-Semitic in character. So there's a guy named Justin Raimundo, a rabid paleocon, who despite his right-wing politics is liked by certain parts of the supposed left, like Counterpunch, for his attacks on the neocons, and he manages to tie the neocons to Trotskyism, predictably with a strong emphasis on the Jewishness of both. Also, Stalin, in his struggle with the United Opposition, pointed out the original names of Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, thus clearly reminding people that they were all of Jewish origin and thus not real Russians. Trotsky was shocked by this and protested the intrusion of anti-Semitism into inter-party debate. Also, my friend David, whom I mentioned previously, recalled that in the 1930s, Jewish Stalinists would often taunt Jewish Trotskyists by calling Trotsky Label, thus using the Yiddish diminutive of his first name. And furthermore, although Jews have been overrepresented on all parts of the left in modern times, and this is a post-1848 phenomenon, by the way, if you look at the great bourgeois revolutions, the French Revolution, the British Revolution, Jews played no part in those revolutions, although all of those bourgeois revolutions had a major impact on Jews. So the Dutch Revolt made Holland the most tolerant place in Europe for Jews. The British Revolution in the 17th century ended the ban on Jews in Britain and reintroduced the Jews after several hundred years. And the French Revolution led to the emancipation of Jews, the first country in Europe fully to emancipate the Jews. But anyway, and this phenomenon, which clearly peaked in the early and mid-20th century, is also now clearly in decline. But during this period, although I think it's certainly the case, although statistics would be hard, if not impossible, to come by, I think it's clear that an even larger percentage of Trotskyists were Jews than on the left than the participation of Jews as a whole. I'm not quite sure why this is the case. Perhaps this had something to do with the internationalism of Trotskyism. It's also interesting that a lot of the hardline Stalinist leaders of countries in Eastern Europe, right after the war, were also Jewish, of Jewish origin, and were often sacrificed. It's interesting that you often had a situation where the national communist leader was not Jewish and the ultra-Stalinist leader was Jewish. And again, I don't know what the logic of that is exactly. Nevertheless, despite the large number of Trotskyists of Jewish origin, and despite the utterly honorable record of Trotskyism opposing anti-Semitism, at least as long as it came from the right or Stalinist bureaucrats, the record of Trotskyists on anti-Semitism coming from Middle Eastern or other third world peoples has not been as good, but this belongs to a later historical period than the one we're considering. Nevertheless, the Trotskyist response to the Holocaust was a bit problematic. The initial response of the militant to the first pictures coming out of the liberated concentration camps like Bergen-Belsen was to dismiss them as atrocity propaganda designed to create hatred against the German people, who had also been victims of fascism. This was, of course, not the typical response of the left. It wouldn't have been the response of Stalinists or Social Democrats, and the militant quickly corrected itself. Now, there's an interesting debate between Ernest Mandel, who became a leader of the Fourth International and was the most prominent Marxist economist of the post-war period, and Albert Glotzer, whom I mentioned previously, and who at the time, though, was not a right social democrat, but like Shachtman, still someone who considered himself a revolutionary Marxist. Now, both Mandel and Glotzer were themselves Jews. Both were, of course, atheists, but both were quite open about their Jewish ethnic background. And Mandel, in fact, was much more closely affected by the Holocaust than Glotzer, who was in the U.S., and it had touched him quite closely. Close friends and comrades, not to mention some relatives, but people like Abraham Leon, the theoretician of the Jewish question, had perished in Auschwitz. And in his biography, there's a quite poignant image of these like Trotskyists coming back from concentration camps. There's very poignant images. But anyway, as Glotzer correctly observed, however, in this article, Mandel, in his response to the historic specificity of Jewish suffering, had a detached and almost inhuman quality. He writes, Germain, that was Mandel's party name's essay, marks one of the first efforts of the official Fourth International to speak somewhat concretely on the Jewish question. But it is distinguished by its utterly detached and abstract approach to the problem, which is characteristic for its unquestionably correct interpretations of parts of an old Marxist position, but which has little to do with life today. Where Germain Mandel is on his own, i.e. where he is compelled to concern himself with the concrete problems of the day, he is thrown into one quandary after another. But they are of no consequence, for thereafter he sweeps away the whole problem with lofty disdain born of the superhistorical approach. The article, Glotzer continues, can be summarized briefly. The Jews of Europe have undergone almost inhuman suffering. This is due to the nature of capitalism. But the Jews are not alone in this suffering. Other peoples, other national minorities are faced with the same or similar prospects of extermination or near extermination. This is a symbol of the decay of capitalism. There is no hope for these people except in the victory of socialism. It's true that the Jews may be entirely exterminated between now and the future. But oops, sorry, that can't be helped, you know. That's capitalism for you. The Jews, despite this grim prospect, must not allow themselves to be emotionally worked up by the fact that 6 million of them have been wiped out in Europe. Now, part of the backdrop of this argument is the different position of the Shachtmanites and the Fourth International on the question of immigration to Palestine. So the Shachtmanites supported free immigration for Jews to Palestine. The Fourth International was opposing it, though they, of course, supported free immigration of Jews elsewhere in the world, like the United States, which was also closed to them. But beyond the particular positions, and quite unrelated to the greater Shachtmanite softness of Zionism, there's a deeper point here. After all, was the extermination of European Jews really simply just another manifestation of, quote, of the decay of capitalism? If so, then British and American capitalism might just as likely to generate a genocidal anti-Semitism. So actually, if you read Mandel's piece, far from downplaying the threat of anti-Semitism, despite its anti-Zionism, it actually seems to suggest that the removal of Nazism has not really done anything to make the Jews of the world safer, which is kind of insane, because obviously there was a huge difference for the Jews of Europe between American and British imperialism and German imperialism. So what strikes me about the discussion of the Jewish question in this period for Trotskyists is its simultaneously overwrought and abstract character. And even on the question of Palestine, Trotskyist policy, in contrast to Stalinism, which, again, Stalinism was always doing these volte-face, so it had been anti-Zionist until 1947, but then it became very pro-Israeli during the period 1947 to 49. So the Stalinists weren't ambivalent, they just were for Israel and claimed that the Arab armies were, that the Israelis were actually fighting an anti-imperialist war of liberation, etc. But the Trotskyist position, although in the abstract it took a stand based on anti-imperialism and revolutionary solidarity between peoples, which was correct at some level, nevertheless seemed at a loss on how to proceed in a situation so far removed from its classical Marxist text. Because unlike the Stalinists, they couldn't rely simply on cynical considerations of great power politics. So there was real sympathy for the Jews. There was a continuation of a classical Marxist anti-Zionism. And there was a recognition of the right-wing character of the Arab political leadership. So Trotskyists did not support the Arab invasion. But this led basically to slogans that had an unreal air to them. So it's very hard to imagine anyone in Palestine, either an Arab or for either Arab or Jewish workers, being moved or affected by these slogans. The real question, however, which was not addressed by people like Mandel, is whether the confidence of Marxist Jews and other Marxists in the capitalist character of anti-Semitism and their faith in the European working class to protect the Jews from the fascist onslaught might not have been misplaced in some way. But that question was simply too painful for people like Mandel to contemplate. So it was not lack of sympathy for the Jews that was the problem, but fear that if they contemplated too deeply the Jewish catastrophe that was so fresh in their consciousness, that it might prove a challenge to their Marxism. And paradoxically, actually, a lot of Zionists at the same period also sort of dealt with the Holocaust in a very mechanical manner and were not very sympathetic. So it wasn't just Marxists, but it's another subject. Now, the period directly after the war is a complex and transitional phase. So it's not just that Nazism was defeated, Eastern Europe turned into the, Stalin's zone. Countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, after their liberation, did not go directly into being Stalinist dictatorships, but rather for several years were multi-party parliamentary regimes with functioning bourgeois or non-communist socialist parties. So some Trotskyists expected that this kind of quasi-capitalist status would maintain and that they would sort of be Finlandized. Thus, while the overall trend of this period was towards a consolidation of bourgeois democracy in the West and Stalinist dictatorship in the East, the development was not instantaneous. Thus, as late as 1947, there were, for example, communist Stalinist ministers in the French government and bourgeois, peasant, and non-Stalinist socialist parties operating in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now, since we're skimming very quickly over the history, let's observe some points about this period. Many Trotskyists were clearly in denial about what was happening, since it went directly contrary to what Trotsky had predicted before the war. In the Socialist Workers' Party at the time, for example, the discrepancy between reality and the theory officially proclaimed by the party as reality was so glaring that it was challenged by Felix Morrow and Albert Goldman. Goldman and Morrow were in fundamental disagreement with the catastrophic perspective of the SWP leadership and that of most of the Fourth International. Specifically, they were very much against the theses on the American Revolution adopted late in 1946, which had been in the process of formulation for as long as 3 years before that. They disagreed with the SWP leadership on at least 4 major points. They believed that post-war Europe would experience a strong economic recovery based in large part on aid from the United States. They argued that bourgeois democracy would be restored in Western Europe rather than the dictatorships foreseen by the SWP majority. They maintained that the revolution was not imminent in Western Europe, but was rather a matter of at least several decades off. Finally, they argued that during this considerable time, the best policy was for Trotskyist parties to push for the utmost extension of bourgeois democracy as the only feasible way of showing its inadequacies for the achievement of socialism. Morrow also argued against the majority's insistence that the United States intended to dismember the European economies once it had defeated the Nazis. Although in the long term he admitted that U.S. imperialism could solve none of Europe's economic problems, in the short term, he said, American imperialism will provide food and economic aid to Europe so that unlike the Nazi occupation, the American occupation will be followed by improvement in food supplies and in the economic situation generally. Where the Nazis removed factory machinery and transportation equipment, the Americans will bring them in. The Stalinists also, Soviet Union also took factories and things away. He also pointed out how absurd the Fourth International's expectation of a German revolution was. To put it bluntly, all the phrases in his predictions about a German revolution, that the proletariat would play a decisive role, soldiers' committees, workers' and peasant Soviets, were copied down again in January 1945 by the European Secretariat from the 1938 program of the Fourth International. Goldman and Morrow both subsequently abandoned Trotskyism. I think that Goldman ended up in the Socialist Party and Morrow ended up as a right-winger. Now, somewhere I remember a long time ago reading in a comment on the Goldman-Morrow tendency by the Sparks that while Goldman and Morrow were empirically accurate, should be obvious to anyone, they had bad programmatic appetites. And this comment has always raised for me an interesting question of whether it's possible that dogmatism can actually make people politically smarter, that there might be a connection between being willing to ignore reality and maintaining the correct political position. It's something that's always disturbed me. People might stay on track by ignoring reality. Anyway, it's also sometimes claimed by Trotskyists that Stalinist parties, there were huge mass parties in France and Italy, let slip revolutionary opportunities, and that once again the masses were betrayed by their misleaders. Whether or not this is true, the fact remains that the Trotskyists everywhere in Europe were unable to influence the course of events, including Greece, where an actual civil war was raging. Indeed, it was precisely this feeling of impotence and irrelevance vis-a-vis the mass Stalinist parties that generated the phenomenon of Pabloism. But now let's look at the other part of Europe where capitalism was overthrown, not through workers' revolution, but through the military presence of the Soviet Union. Here the workers were not betrayed by Stalinism, but rendered the passive objects of a revolution dictated by the security needs of the Soviet state, rather than by the working class as the subject of history. Stalinism made the revolution in a social or sociological, though not political sense, despite the workers. The actual history of the workers in these countries and their response to this social revolution or sociological revolution from above has not been adequately studied. Now, I'd intended to talk in much greater length about one particular country, Poland, and the role of the working class in this revolution. There are several reasons why Poland makes an interesting case study in the problem of the export of revolution via the Red Army, for Poland was a country with both a deep, rich radical tradition and a strong history of nationalism. The miracle on the Vistula in 1920, which stopped the Red Army at the gates of Warsaw, was, depending upon one's point of view, a great victory for the independence of the Polish nation, or a great defeat of the World Revolution. Finally, the rise of Solidarność played a significant role in the unraveling of Stalinism, and more fundamentally, raises questions about the nature of, quote, class consciousness. Now, because this is already going on for too long, and we don't have the matter to treat the matter as extensively as I wish, let me make the following observation. So, for example, describing this transitional period, Padrea Kenny, a pretty good observer, notes that workers in 1945 to 1948 were disinclined to engage in debate over national issues or to participate in political organizations. Their lack of interest in formal partisan politics was a valuable asset for the ruling parties, namely the Stalinists. The simple fact of repression is not enough to explain this fact, for the regime had relatively little control over workers in other ways. And then talking about the specific situation, to give you a picture of the period, for all their talk about reactionary forces, the PPR, the Polska Partia Robotnicza, this is the Polish Workers' Party, the Stalinist leaders, continued to see the PPS, this is the Polish Socialist Party, so the R is the Stalinist, the S are the Social Democrats, who were sort of allied in an alliance, but were also rivals. They saw the PPS, this independent Polish socialists, as the greatest threat in the factory. The Łódź PPS was notoriously independent, and in mid-1945, the PPR claimed that the PPS controlled all the smaller trade unions. In the 1946 May Day celebrations, the PPR sought to enforce a parade under jointly carried banners. A schism ensued with most of the workers marching apart from the PPR, unofficially with the PPS. The same year, the two parties marched separately also in Wrocław. At the September 1946 plenum, Gomulka, the Stalinist leader, warned of the dangers from a hegemonistic PPS, this independent socialist party, and accused the PPS of completely rejecting the idea of the United Front. So what's so striking to me about the Scènes de la vie quotidienne is that they show a Stalinism triumphing neither through the enthusiasm of the workers, which certainly did not exist. Presumably the workers would spontaneously have inclined towards the PPS, not the PBR, nor through sheer brute terror. Stalinism triumphed, rather, neither by quite winning over the workers, although the Stalinists did make efforts at the factory level to win over the workers, nor by massively terrorizing them, but mostly through their relative passivity. It's no doubt true, I mean, there was terror and there was repression, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's no doubt true that most Polish workers in this period, for most of them, the Stalinist bureaucrats were just another set of bosses. But that's ultimately why they accept them, just as workers in the West accept capitalism even though they may hate their bosses. Ultimately, unlike the revolutionary socialist notion of an emancipated society, Stalinism was familiar at the daily level, even though it radically transformed the economic basis of society. Paradoxically, too, Stalinism, with its constant workerist images and rhetoric, reinforced a retrograde but real class consciousness among Polish workers. This enabled Solidarność to be later simultaneously the revolt of Catholic nationalist Poland against communism and the revolt of workers against the bosses represented by the party state. So, moving on, although I'd like to talk more about Poland and other issues here. Finally, we get to the period of high Stalinism, the Zionovщина, the USSR, the really most intense repression in Eastern Europe, the period of the late 40s and early 50s. Now, unlike Stalinism in 1937, the Soviet Union was now a superpower with nuclear weapons after 1949, and apparently the leader of a vast Eurasian bloc. There was as yet no sign of Soviet split, and with the exception of Tito, no sign yet of national communism. Stalinism was no longer an isolated and potentially fragile dictatorship, but seemed to many people poised to contend for global hegemony. Stalinism in this period, and this is the period of the novel 1984, which was supposedly, Orwell just changed the last two digits of 1948, seemed to many people a huge totalitarian monolith spanning Eurasia. Now, this too would prove a temporary phase and would be followed by relative liberalization and multipolar tendencies in the socialist camp. Stalinism certainly was not a monolith, nor, despite what many people imagined at the time, was a Third World War inevitable between Stalinism and the bourgeois West. It did not happen. The impression that this is where history was leading, though, had an effect on Trotskyists. Many embraced the notion of the historical inevitability of Stalinism and hoped the war would radicalize it. Others adopted opposite conclusions and became Cold War social democrats. They were still in principle committed to the idea of socialism, but they subordinated it to the need to defend the West against the totalitarian monster of Stalinism. So there were essentially four theoretical responses to the problem of the expansion of Stalinism after the war. One was the orthodox response, which was to minimize the significance of the problem. In this view, Trotsky was essentially correct, even if his individual predictions had not been. A second response was the bureaucratic collectivist diagnosis. Stalinism was a new type of class society, hitherto unknown. The third, opposed response, was an adaptation towards Stalinism. The most extreme form of this was Pabloism, but Deutscher could be considered a milder form of it. This diagnosis agreed with the orthodox version sociologically, but considered the prospect of political revolution in the degenerated and deformed worker states unrealistic. Nevertheless, it held that the overthrow of capitalism in a large part of the globe remained progressive. The first response represents a denial of the problem. The second and third responses are essentially rejections of Trotsky's analysis, but in opposed political directions. One emphasizes to the exclusion of any other considerations the need for a revolution against the bureaucracy, and the other denies the need. So for what Trotsky had been a dialectical tension, the need to defend collectivized property on the one hand, and the need for workers' democracy on the other, had been resolved two ways into its constituent elements. So the bureaucratic collectivists defend the idea of workers' democracy, and the Pabloists defend the progressive aspect of collectivized property. Now finally we come to state capitalist theories. These theories, like bureaucratic collectivism, also rejected the deformed, degenerated worker state thesis, but unlike them saw Stalinism as not a new form of class society, but rather a new manifestation of an old form. Stalinist regimes were actually capitalist, albeit state capitalist. Unlike the other theories whose terms are fairly clear, even if their political conclusions are not so, state capitalism is a slippery term. Variants of state capitalist theories have been put forth by people with as different political agendas as Tony Cliff, Moishe Postone, and Charles Bettelheim, the Maoist. And in fact, Maoism generally actually inclines to state capitalist theories of one kind or another. Because it is a widespread response to Stalinism, and if valid, would represent a fundamental rethinking of Marxism, I will deal with it at greater length than the others. Now, I want to make clear, because my position on this, it is not the case that I object to state capitalism because of the politics it leads to. This is a defense of my annoyance about state capitalism by James Wan, for example. One can, it seems, in fact, be a state capitalist and end up, for example, as a social democrat, a Maoist, or a supporter of the ISO. State capitalism can lead to all sorts of different politics. It's also the case that Lenin and other Bolsheviks appear to have used the term during the 1920s. But to speak of the Soviet Union in 1922 as state capitalist has, I believe, a quite different meaning from claiming that it was state capitalist in 1962. The fundamental insight of state capitalist theories is that in Stalinist societies, workers subjectively experience their relationship to management in much the same way as workers in the West did, even though they supposedly lived in a worker state. The fundamental flaw with state capitalist theories is that they can only, by wild distortion, find analogs to the laws of motion of capital that Marx analyzed in Das Kapital, and by thus substituting a pseudo-economic category, the political character of the problem is obscured. Now, since I'm talking to a platypus audience here, I realize that I'm handicapped by an additional terminological problem relating to the words capital and capitalism. Many people in platypus might speak of the problem of overcoming capital, whereas I, a backward provincial, would use the phrase abolishing capitalism. What is in those additional three letters, ism? Perhaps a lot, perhaps not. The best argument for using the term capital, not capitalism, is the vulgar and absurd misuse of the latter term. So, for example, I heard Michael Moore on MSNBC some time ago saying that he is in favor of abolishing capitalism. But then it turned out from the interview that either he does not understand the term capitalism or he does not understand the term abolish. To clarify my terms, however, I wish to make it clear that I am not, others in Platypus have a different usage, making the word capital stand in for all the features of societies dominated by capital. Capital, as I am using it, is merely the economic core of such societies, not the totality of social relationships that characterize them. I'm aware that economy cannot be separated from the rest of society, but to the extent that it can. Thus, Chris wrote on the list yesterday, for example, speaking about Robert Kurz, the German Marxist theoretician who died, Kurz thought that we could step out of capital as a function of its extended crisis, whereas Adorno's point is that capital can only be overcome by being reconstituted as socially, politically consciously as possible. It's not that I disagree with Chris's point here. Don't know enough about Kurz to comment, but as far as I understand his point about Adorno, I agree. But for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that I'm discussing Trotskyism and Trotskyists, I will stick to a quite different use of the term capital. I actually prefer this older language, but aside from my personal preference, I think that I have a valid excuse here. It's sort of like talking about the 1940s and 50s and saying Negro instead of African American. Capital has, as I'm using it, a twofold character. It is first of all things. For example, the means of production themselves. It is second of all a social relationship embedded in a particular type of society. That is, capital is either the means of production themselves, the ownership of the means of production, or the money that gives one access to that ownership and enables one to buy the human labor power to make them work. Both ownership and money are obviously not material things, but social conventions embedded in other power relations. The first aspect of capital I mentioned both logically precedes and can historically survive the second aspect. It is the second aspect that is the target for Marxist critique. A factory that produces automobiles, regardless of social system, consists of machines that are made to work by workers. The seizure of the factory by a worker Soviet, or its nationalization, transforms the social relationship, but not the material fact. A backward country will remain a backward country even after the bourgeoisie and the landlords are expropriated. It is also the case that the complexity of industrial life seems to require management and supervision of the labor process. Again, in a normal capitalist society, management serves the interests of the owners of capital against the workers. But to what extent is management an objective necessity? Of production, that is. I'm reminded of the story of how, after the Russian Revolution, attempts were made to have orchestras without conductors. This was soon given up. It just didn't work. The point I'm trying to make is that there are three interrelated but separate problems in the construction of, quote, socialism, unquote. One is the problem of exploitation, of receiving, or rather not receiving, the value of one's labor. The other is the problem of democracy, our economic decisions made by the masses through a transparent democratic process. The third is the problem of authority. Even a society where workers own the means of production and which is genuinely democratic would probably face the problem of authority, namely that some people, democratically elected people perhaps, would be telling others what to do. All of these are aspects of the alienating character of work in capitalist society, and all of them can and do persist in a transitional phase. For example, you may as a worker be economically exploited by the state in order to industrialize rapidly. Theoretically, you may be exploiting yourself as the owner of the means of production in the worker state, but you probably won't experience it that way. This was the core of the argument between Trotsky and the workers' opposition, in which Lenin split the difference. So do workers need unions to defend themselves against exploitation by the worker state? If society as a whole, represented by the political leadership of the worker state, needs workers to exploit themselves, why should the short-sighted selfishness of particular workers be allowed to stand in the way? And does it matter if it's supposedly a healthy worker state or a degenerated or deformed one? I mean, should there be labor unions in a truly democratic worker state? Might be an open question. You may, as a worker, be dealing, for example, with an unresponsive managerial bureaucracy and have no way to express your discontents. If you live in a one-party state with rigged elections, the dictatorship of the proletariat amounts to nothing more for you than the dictatorship of party bureaucrats. So should one defend automatically the struggle of workers against the bureaucracy then? This issue was raised by the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1980 to 81. Overwhelmingly, Trotskyists did support Solidarność at the time and hailed the rise of Solidarność as the political reawakening of the Polish working class. One of the very few exceptions to this enthusiasm for Solidarność on the Marxist left was the Spartacist League, which correctly pointed out that Solidarność was a political movement aiming at capitalist restoration. At the time, this seemed to most Trotskyists a sectarian and even perhaps a Stalinist perspective. But the results are now in, and empirically it was clearly correct. The victory of Solidarność led to the restoration of capitalism in Poland. Theoretically, there are in fact two questions raised by this. Firstly, how can Marxists understand the mass political mobilization of the working class for politically retrograde goals? What does this say about the notion of class consciousness? Secondly, was it right for the Spartacists, even though they were empirically correct about the character of Solidarność, to support Stalinist repression against an organization that clearly had the support of the great majority of the Polish workers? After all, not only has capitalism been restored in Poland, so has bourgeois democracy. Some might argue the restoration of bourgeois democracy, even with the restoration of capitalism, still creates better opportunities for the struggle for socialism than under the Stalinists. To the best of my knowledge, no self-proclaimed Trotskyist group made this argument at the time. Rather, they deluded themselves into seeing unconscious Trotskyists in the Polish workers. Finally, there's an absolute notion of human freedom, which includes the aspiration to a society where people do not have to do work they do not like and are not told what to do by others. There's a big gap between asserting that the advantages of modern technology theoretically create the possibility of a society of each according to his needs, and actually creating one even after a revolution. So even if we had a worldwide socialist revolution, there would probably be a very long time in which people would still be doing work they did not like, dealing with frustrating bureaucracies, with antisocial attitudes and authoritarian personalities. But the question that must be raised here is to what extent these problems could be called capitalism. I think that unless the term capitalism is radically redefined, state capitalism is a deeply misleading term, one chosen not for analytical reasons, but for political ones. North Korea is a grotesque society. Surely we do not want to admit that it has anything to do with socialism, or is even an extremely deformed worker state. Better to rename it state capitalism. Now, there are two objections to what I'm saying. Richard, I hear some of you grumbling. But isn't North Korea a poor backward state, still subject to capital, because capital dominates on a world scale? Are you not, in your orthodoxy, privileging the nation state? I also, coming from a similar place, hear the response, but Richard, are you not fetishizing the bourgeoisie? Do we not already know from Marx that capitalists are just the mask of capital? The answer to the first point is yes. Obviously, a backward, autarkic nation state like North Korea is still subject to the pressures of global capitalism, and its crazy behavior is not otherwise explicable. But equally clearly, the domination of capital functions differently in South Korea from North Korea. Furthermore, the existence of places like North Korea is simply inexplicable without Marxism, albeit a deformed caricature of Marxism. No state capitalist society has ever come into existence except through the existence of political parties and revolutions claiming to be anti-capitalist. Now, what about this point about capital without capitalists? That capitalists are simply masked for capital, which is the real subject of history. Here my feeling is that the word capital is being used to mean different things in quite slippery ways, including, among other things, those that I would prefer to use terms like repressive bourgeois social norms or modern industrial society, and many other terms, for instead of capital. The society Karl Marx analyzed in Das Kapital and that classical Marxism developed as a response to is a society of competing capitals, and a society where individuals own capital. This is not a minor fact. As that great Marxist philosopher Mitt Romney observed, corporations are people, and of course he is quite right. The means of production in the United States are owned overwhelmingly by a few hundred corporations, but these corporations are owned by flesh and blood people, and a very small minority of the American population, meaning the flesh and blood population, not the corporate population, owns the bulk of them. Now, in one sense, the behavior and attitudes of the people who own and run American corporations are quite irrelevant. Hence the imbecility of those who denounce corporate greed and the 1% and all that. And the bourgeoisie, in this sense, are indeed the character mask for capital. But the fact that a bourgeoisie exists in the United States or South Korea, but did not exist in the Soviet Union and does not in North Korea, is also a profoundly significant fact. This is not because the struggle against capital should be understood in fetishistic terms as a struggle against the owners of that capital, but because a society in which capital is owned by individuals is actually sociologically quite different from one in which it is owned by the state. In some respects, the Soviet Union could have been described as a gigantic corporation, yet it was a corporation with a well-paid top management, but without shareholders. It's an important difference. As such, the principle of its organization remained fundamentally non-capitalist, and that is why the real capitalist world could never assimilate it. It is not the case that the Cold War represented merely another great power rivalry, the struggle between two imperialisms, but it was rather a fundamental conflict between social systems. The inability of so many on the far left to understand the structural significance of the Cold War, particularly those from an anarchist, Maoist, and non-orthodox Trotskyist state capitalist tradition, contributed to the psychological disarmament of the left after 1989. By claiming that the repressive societies of the East Bloc had, quote, nothing to do with socialism, the profound rightward shift of world politics post-1989 becomes either obscured or mysterious. The victory of neoliberalism is seen simply as a manifestation of the gratuitous viciousness of the bourgeoisie. At the heart of this debate lies the tension between the moral and political ideals of Marxism and its scientific and analytic character. To quote the eloquent Max Shachtman, if the cold horror of Stalinist despotism, that vast prison camp of peoples and nations, represents the victory of socialism, then we are lost. Then the ideal of socialist freedom, justice, equality, and brotherhood has proved to be an unattainable utopia. Then the National Association of Manufacturers is right in saying that while capitalism is not perfect and has a couple of defects here and there, socialism is a new slavery. And then we must be resigned to that appalling decay of modern civilization that is eating away the substance of human achievement. But if it can be shown that Stalinist Russia is not socialism, that it has nothing in common with socialism, that it is only another and very ominous lesson of what happens to society when the working class fails to fight and extends its fight for socialism, or when its fight is arrested and crushed, if it can be shown that Stalinist Russia is a new barbarism, which results precisely from our failure up to now to establish a socialist society, to extend the revolution of 1917 that took place in Russia, then, despite the agony that grips the world today, there is a hope and a future for the socialist emancipation of the race. It is from that standpoint, and no other, that I will seek to show that Stalinist Russia has nothing at all in common with socialism. The best way to begin is by defining socialism. Socialism is based on the common ownership and democratic control of the means of production and exchange, upon production for use as against production for profit, upon the abolition of all classes, all class divisions, class privilege, class rule, upon the production of such abundance that the struggle for material needs is completely eliminated, so that humanity at last freed from economic exploitation, from oppression, from any form of coercion by a state machine, can devote itself to its fullest intellectual and cultural development. Much can perhaps be added to this definition, but anything less you can call whatever you wish, but it will not be socialism. Now, if this definition is correct, as it has been considered by every socialist from the days of Marx to the days of Lenin, there's not only not a trace of socialism in Russia, but it is moving in a direction which is the very opposite of socialism. Now, for all its undoubted eloquence, several important issues are conflated here. Asserting that the Soviet Union was not capitalist and asserting that it was socialist are not the same thing. One can also assert that the bourgeoisie, that the bureaucracy rather, is not a new ruling class without denying the existence of bureaucratic despotism. The class character of this despotism is a theoretical, not moral issue. One could, I think, even admit that under certain circumstances, the non-class despotism of the bureaucracy might be worse than the class rule of the bourgeoisie. It's also true, as Shachtman says, that if the cold horror of Stalinist despotism, that vast prison camp of peoples and nations, represents the victory of socialism, then we are lost. But it does not follow that there is not only not a trace of socialism in Russia, but it is moving in a direction which is the very opposite of socialism. 20 years after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, we can see that Trotsky's idea in the 1930s, then shared by Shachtman, that the Soviet Union contained important traces of 1917 without by any means being the socialist ideal of 1917, was both more dialectical and more empirically accurate than the moralistic revulsion of Shachtman in 1950, which was also a response to Cold War hysteria. And it's also important in speaking of the cold horror of the prison camp of nations of Stalinism, not to equate Stalinism simply with the Gulag. For while it is certainly the case that Stalinism led to the millions of deaths of millions and at times ruled by sheer terror, it's not generally the case that Stalinism, in the broad sociological sense, was simply dependent on terror. Indeed, in one respect, for example, labor discipline in factories, Stalinism was in its normal phase inferior to capitalism. It was hard to fire workers in the Soviet Union, and without a reserve army of the unemployed, hard to enforce normal capitalist patterns of labor discipline. As a widespread joke of the Soviet period went, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. For as much as Stalinism was at times a system based on sheer terror, it was always also one based on banality, and it was the banality more than the terror that enabled it to survive. Thus, while the Gulag did in fact represent slavery in modern form, it would be wrong to characterize the Soviet Union as a system generally characterized by slavery. It was not based on slavery as a fundamental social norm. Now, I would now like to put forward two interpretations of 1917 for consideration, not because I consider them correct, I consider them both fundamentally wrong, nor because Trotsky would have agreed with either, he would have disagreed with both, but rather because in interesting ways they point to the deep problems surrounding 1917. Both interpretations come from Italian Marxists who played major roles in the Italian Communist Party in the 1920s, in fact, as factional opponents of each other. One is Antonio Gramsci, and the other Amedeo Bordiga. Bordiga led the left faction, actually the ultra-left faction, and Gramsci the center. Gramsci was supported by the Bolsheviks and the Comintern. There are two assertions that I would now like to pose as questions for us. Are Gramsci's claim that the Bolshevik Revolution was above all a revolution against capital, which is to say a revolution against both capital and the book Capital, and the second, namely Bordiga's interpretation of 1917 as a bourgeois revolution. Both of these assertions will in various permutations confront left critiques of Stalinism throughout the 20th century. To what extent does Bolshevism represent the intrusion of voluntarism into Marxism as a materialist philosophy? And to what extent, if all, if any, can the Bolshevik Revolution then be said to represent a break from capitalism, or capital, if you prefer? For while both Gramsci and Bordiga, despite their differences, admired Lenin, both these lines of argument point to fundamental questions that can just as easily be used against Bolshevism. So Gramsci and Kautsky, for example, begin at the same point but reach diametrically opposite conclusions. Postone's critique of Bolshevism, like many others, touches on both Gramsci's and Bordiga's points. Both these interpretations are, of course, antithetical to Trotsky's theoretical conceptions. Thus, Gramsci's punning theory of a revolution against capital suggests that Leninism actually represented a deviation from classical Marxism under the guise of fidelity to it. Leninism was a new creative addition to Marxism, not merely as Trotsky, and one might add Platypus, or Lenin himself would have understood it, the continuation of the left wing of the Second International. In Bordiga's view, on the other hand, Lenin in a fundamental sense was a Jacobin, not merely by way of analogy as with Trotsky, but rather the Russian Revolution was really a bourgeois revolution, period. Now, it should be pointed out that neither Gramsci nor Bordiga was consciously anti-Leninist, but both of these theories, in effect, attribute the true significance of the Bolshevik Revolution to the cunning of history and suggest that its meaning was quite different from what the Bolsheviks intended. Both of these theories remove the tragic aspect of the revolution that was so prominent for Trotsky. Neither of these theories is defensible in my view, but I want to put them forward because I think that they are interesting as a contrast to Trotskyism, although Gramsci's, I think, has an element of truth in it, and Bordiga's will in different versions prove quite seductive to many different people. What they point out is how difficult the experience of the Bolshevik Revolution has been to assimilate for Marxists. For the central problem about 1917 was that it was never repeated. This unrepeatability of 1917 lies at the center of the Trotskyist insight and has proven its greatest stumbling block. In the immediate aftermath of 1917, there were many attempts to repeat it, but they failed. Until after the Second World War, there was only one non-capitalist state in the world. Stalinism was then a singular phenomenon. But even when there were others later, quite a few others, none of them came about through a process that really resembled 1917. Castro, Mao, Tito, and Ho Chi Minh were figures very different from Lenin and Trotsky, and if they produced societies that resembled the Soviet Union in many ways, then that just makes the date 1917 all the more obscure. This failure to repeat 1917 must be central to our interrogation of it. Over 90 years later, Trotskyists such as the Sparks, the IBT, and so forth, but also Platypus, all look to 1917 as a high point. But why have 3 generations of Marxists failed to replicate this miracle? If in fact revolutionary leadership was key to the Bolshevik success in 1917, why has adequate revolutionary leadership been in such short supply since then? The reason I therefore raise Gramsci and Bordiga here in a lecture devoted to Trotskyism is that they both raise in a rather sly fashion the notion that the central event in the history of Marxism is one that Marxism is incapable of comprehending, putting this forward as a possibility. In this view, 1917 is not so much a pinnacle as a blind spot. This sense that Marxism failed theoretically at the point where it most profoundly altered history is no doubt not the point that either Gramsci or Bordiga thought they were making, and I'm perhaps taking them out of context to make the point here. It is, however, this voice that I've heard arguing against Trotsky. Is it possible that Trotsky, precisely because of his classical Marxism, misunderstood 1917? That classical Marxism foundered in some way on its greatest achievement? I'm getting to the end, folks. Trotskyism, like Platypus, has a deeply tragic view of the history of the 20th century. It eschews the false optimism of the accomplished fact, whether Stalinist or social democrat, and it eschews the false optimism of anarchists, which validates itself either in the continuation of the struggle or in the illusion of liberated space. Trotskyism, at its best, by contrast, offers an extremely sober view of the history of the 20th century as one of terrible defeats for the working class and Marxism, and of vast, unnecessary human suffering. It combines this sobriety, however, with a radical optimism that cannot be derived from any empirical observations and seems to be contradicted by the actual history of Trotskyism itself, which is nothing but a continuous history of political irrelevance and futility. To be a Trotskyist seems, therefore, to require a suspension of disbelief and the suspension of the revolutionary process. Over time, the number of people willing to suspend their disbelief seems to diminish. I do not mean to suggest by this that I think that Trotskyism has been refuted by history. Unlike Stalinism, which I think has been decisively refuted by history, Trotskyism has merely entered a realm where it seems irrefutable. This irrefutable character of Trotskyism is in fact the problem. As long as there are Trotskyists around, the Trotskyist attitude will be tempting. It seems to me, however, more of a religious temptation than a political one. Although this analogy will sound pejorative to any actual Trotskyist who may be listening, I really mean it with the greatest of respect. I remember when, as a callow youth, I went to the then existing Socialist Workers' Party bookstore in downtown Manhattan, and still trying to figure out the difference between various groups, I brought up some points that the Spartacist League had made. "Oh," said the guy from the Socialist Workers' Party, obviously irritated by the mention of the Spartacist League, "those people treat Marxism as a religion." But strangely enough, this remark, which was meant to dismiss the Sparks, somehow raised them in my eyes. Obscurely, although I knew that the Spartacists would hate the analogy. I both recognized the truth of the Socialist Workers' Party guy's comment and felt that it was appropriate. It was after all clear to me even then that Marxism was not, as Marxists, including the Sparks like to claim, a science, and that while obviously a revulsion towards the many barbaric aspects of bourgeois society was a vital aspect of becoming a Marxist, that oppression per se, neither one's own oppression nor even horror at the oppression of others, was what made people into Marxists. Certainly I was not one of the oppressed, and while I was certainly aware of the real oppression of billions of others, it was not moral indignation that drew me towards Marxism. On the contrary, I had often observed that the people I knew who were most morally indignant found Marxism actually rather hard to swallow. What attracted me to Marxism then, and still does, was that it seemed to give meaning to history, and thus indirectly perhaps to my own life. And this quest for meaning is very similar to what religion provides for believers. For Platypus, the fundamental question, and these lectures, everything comes back to Platypus, remains in what way, without a return to Trotskyism, can a genuinely revolutionary Marxist politics survive? I see essentially three answers to this question. The first answer is that Platypus is a placeholder, which at some point will be replaced by a new, hitherto unknown form of Marxian politics that will take up the historic torch of the Second International Radicals. The second answer is that Platypus is simply mystification. We're just deluding ourselves. The third answer is that Platypus is a form of mysticism, not mystification. Even if Marxism is no longer an empirically realizable possibility, by affirming it, we are affirming the invisible truth of human history. One might, to use Kafka's language, call this Platypus as parable. Kafka writes in his parable, called On Parables, "Many complain that the words of the wise are always merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says, 'Go over,' he does not mean that we should cross over to an actual place, which we could do anyway if the labor were worth it. He means some fabulous yonder, some unknown to us, something, too, that he cannot designate more precisely and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. All these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, and we know that already. But the cares we have to struggle with every day, that is a different matter. Concerning this, a man once said, 'Why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables, you yourselves would become parables, and with that rid yourself of all your daily cares.' Another said, 'I bet that is also a parable.' The first said, 'You have won.' The second said, 'But unfortunately only in parable.' The first said, 'No, in reality, in parable you have lost.' So I leave it to you, but also more importantly to the future, to judge which of these three possibilities most accurately describes Platypus, as placeholder, as mystification, or as the words of the wise, which are of no use in daily life. Okay. Sorry I went on so long.
No. So we'll do about 20 minutes of questions from here in New York and from elsewhere. So please send me online if you have questions. We'll go till 3:30.
By the way, if you have questions, often, Chris, make the questions larger. I mean, sometimes the questions are obscure when they're typed. I don't know exactly what the question is. Any questions from here?
So, do you think it's wrong to, do you have any, sympathy for the interpretation of the Soviet Union as state capitalism? Or should we,
Do I personally? I thought I made it clear the answer was no.
Okay.
I think it's pure obfuscation.
Okay.
I think
the 1962 diagnosis, right?
Yeah, because what's meant by 1922 is something different. It's a different meaning. The diagnosis that the mature Soviet Union was state capitalist, I think that that's intellectual obscurantism. I mean, it explains nothing about what happened to it. It's mystifying at the political level. The bureaucracy of the Soviet Union didn't behave like a capitalist class. You end up having to redefine capitalism to get there. I think the points Mandel makes are basically correct. I think the Soviet Union represented I mean, basically, if you ask for my interpretation, I'm basically sympathetic to quote the orthodox Trotskyist interpretation. I mean, where I might differ from Trotsky is I'm not sure whether the political conclusions he draws from that necessarily follow. In other words, the fact that the Soviet Union is non-capitalist, does that mean that one has to defend the bureaucracy? Whatever. Does the fact that the victory of Solidarność meant the restoration of capitalism, but also bourgeois democracy, do you privilege collectivized property the way the Sparts did, or the orthodox interpretation would, or Trotsky would have, I would say? Do you privilege collectivized property over democratic norms? That's not clear to me. It's not at all clear. I'm ambivalent. And what do you say about the fact that the vast majority of workers are on the other side? So you're in effect, I mean, the Sparts rhetorically blocked the Stalinist repression of the Polish working class. I mean, they didn't actually have anything to do with it, but symbolically they were supporting it. So the question is, do you want to be in that position? But that's a political question separate from the sociological question. I think saying that, like, Poland in the 1970s and 80s was a capitalist society, a state capitalist society, doesn't explain the transformation to the normal capitalism it is now, or the normal capitalism that was up until the 1940s. It's mystification.
Okay. Just as a response, I have a quick response. So was the argument ever, because it seems, where I would be sympathetic to that argument, which is probably limited, but is the idea that the state as like an entity is producing for the market effectively.
It's not.
Well, was that the argument?
I mean, but the thing is that like fundamentally it's not. Like, it's not the case that the state in these like bureaucratically planned economies that it produced for the market. I mean, there are market elements, but you can't like really understand the functioning of the societies by analogies to the categories of traditional capital. And the reason you can't is because of the difference between a plurality of capitals and a singular capital. I mean, yes, it's true you have enterprises, but the logic of the enterprises is like the subsidiaries. I mean, the analogy of the Soviet Union would be, to some extent, it's a gigantic corporation, but it's a corporation without shareholders. I mean, you can say that like people like Kim Jong-un and the people who live in North Korea, that they exploit the Korean workers. Yes, they do exploit the Korean workers, but they don't exploit the Korean workers in a capitalist fashion. I mean, exploitation doesn't amount to capitalism. Despotism doesn't amount to capitalism. You know, feudalism, people have been exploited under many different categories. I mean, if Stalinism had proven to be a fundamentally permanent feature of the world, I think one could make a case for the bureaucratic collectivism argument much better than the state capitalism argument.
So we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to go first. There's Chris in Chicago. Richard, let's go over the nitty-gritty specifics about the problem of state capitalism politically. We discussed this in Chicago last week at the level of concrete political tasks, that overthrowing bureaucrats is different from overthrowing capitalists, that bureaucrats being subordinated to workers' democracy is different from subordinating capitalists, which would be their abolition as a class in a Marxian sense. Go back to your point on means of production, ownership, relations of society.
Well, I mean, actually, I think that we're actually in agreement here. But actually, I mean, the interesting thing is that if you look, for example, at the question of, Solidarność, right, where the Sparts were almost alone. I mean, you find that quote, the other Orthodox Trotskyists, for the most part, supported Solidarność. So in other words, like the political logic of what was at stake wasn't clearly derived from the question of whether you believed in state capitalism or not. I mean, you had, for example, Maoists, who would support Czechoslovakia in 1968, but would have been horrified at the notion of calling for workers' revolution in China. So state capitalism is compatible as an idea with lots of different political forms. Now, in terms of the basic point about overthrowing bureaucrats, I mean, yes, the basic Trotskyist understanding was that the problem with the Soviet Union was not the economic system. It was the political system. In other words, this gets back to the question of democracy and collectivized property. So Trotsky said, it's good that you have the collectivized property in the Soviet Union. What's bad is that you don't have workers' democracy, right? I mean, at the crudest level, like the notion that Trotsky has of socialism, aside from, of course, ultimately abundance, is collectivized property plus democracy. The fundamental problem in this period that you have is the separation. You have this throughout the Cold War of apparently you have greater democracy in the bourgeois West, and you have collectivized property in the East. So it seems as though you're trying to choose between them. And the problem of the Trotskyists is to insist that you need to bring these aspects together. And you also had the problem during the Second World War of the problem of how to think about the Second World War, which was very different from the First World War, and how to think about fascism. So a lot of people thought, well, maybe fascism and Stalinism represent a kind of similar forms of bureaucratic collectivism. That was also a notion people had. That fascism also represented a new type of capitalism or something radically different. I mean, although it seems pretty clear that the sociological difference between Stalinism and fascism and bourgeois democracy, that Stalinism is very different, and that there's much greater similarity between fascism and bourgeois democracy. Sociologically, although politically, you could say, well, fascism and Stalinism have more in common.
So this, maybe I'll combine a question from Boston and then one other comment Chris made here that I accidentally left out. So one of the questions from Boston from Alex is then, how specifically would you characterize the Soviet Union's economic processes? And Chris then, a sort of in counterpoint in some sense, said, but according to Trotsky in his letter of 1939 to Cannon, the issue is not economic but political.
Okay, I'll get answered. It's, again, Trotsky in the split, it's political in that what Trotsky means by that is how people characterize the Soviet Union is fine as long as they're willing to defend it. In other words, he's not hung up on the term state capitalism, as I seem to be here. What he's hung up on is the question of defense of the Soviet Union. To some extent, what I'm saying in my comments about state capitalism is that since defense of the Soviet Union is not a pressing political issue now, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist to defend, that it's important to think about how one thinks about what the Soviet Union represented. So in other words, Trotsky and other, quote, orthodox Trotskyists were willing to be politically in the same organization as people who held state capitalist theories. I mean, that's, I think, conjuncturally what that amounts to. I mean, there were negotiations after the war for reunification of the Shachtmanites and the Canaanites. It didn't amount to anything. So, obviously they disagreed theoretically, but they thought, well, if we can agree enough politically, we can get back together. I'm going to deal with that in the next lecture. I mean, what I object to particularly about the state capitalism, and particularly maybe it's my irritation with the Cliffites, and the Cliffites have largely dropped it, is what I feel is the mystificatory character. And also, what bothers me about it is the moralistic impulse behind it. Because the impulse to call societies like the Soviet Union state capitalist is really not motivated by analysis. It's motivated by the distaste at saying that the Gulag has anything to do with anything you even remotely call socialism or a worker state. It's very similar to the kind of debates you get into about Israel and apartheid. And if you say to someone, well, Israeli society, Zionism, sociologically is radically different from apartheid, the response is, well, you're an apologist for Zionism. But it's just the fact. It's not true that Israeli capitalism depends upon the exploitation of Arab labor, the way South African capitalism depended on black labor. And all sorts of political consequences flow from that. And if you want to call one thing apartheid and another thing apartheid, you can do that, but it leads to no analytic clarity. It confuses the issue. What you have in the state of Israel and the West Bank is at a sociological, economic, and because of that ultimately political level, radically different from what you had in South Africa. And it affects all sorts of things. And I'm insisting on a certain level of intellectual clarity and honesty in these discussions.
There's a big line, so if you want to go fast, go ahead.
I mean, it's just related to this topic. So, because what you're calling obscurity, it seems to me that when you numbered the 3 problems for any attempt to build like a socialist society, that being like the issue of exploitation and democracy and authority, that, at least to my understanding, what you're saying is that the label state capitalism obscures the way in which dealing with those difficulties creates this sort of like problem. Like the problems of Stalinism can't actually be explained as like the continuation of capitalism under a different guise, so much as like politically one would have to underline like the difficulties of any type of transition into a socialist society. Is that what you mean by obscurity?
Yeah.
I mean, because like there are different ways in which one can understand obscurity. One is like, okay, it's not based on an analysis, right? And you've been sort of emphasizing that part of it. But the other one is like the political lessons. Like if one understands like the non-socialist nature of, let's call it that, like the non-socialist nature of the Soviet Union, but like within a kind of framework that tries to understand like what aspects of which, like what elements like went awry, like what happened, then yeah, I'm in general agreement with that. I just wonder to what extent like can we call that moment of transition a moment in which, and I know you don't like this term, but like this particular moment of transition with those problems that you enumerate, still a moment in which capital is reconstituted, like capital is reconstituted.
Well, okay, since I'm talking about Trotsky and Trotskyism, the terminology here is radically different from what any of the people in the debate are using. So you end up having a question of translation. I mean, I don't think it's really necessary to argue about the question of translation here of terms. I mean, in terms of the question of capital, and somewhat I think this answers, for example, in Poland, like obviously the crisis that triggered the rise of solidarity was triggered by the mismanagement of the Polish economy, by the Polish bureaucracy, and particularly also by the way they'd become heavily indebted to Western bankers. Everybody saw that. Now, does that mean that the Polish workers were really struggling against Western finance capital? Well, in a certain sense, they were. I mean, because that's part of what triggered the crisis, and it's also the incompetence of the Polish bureaucracy. But the political effect of their struggle and the way they subjectively saw their struggle was a struggle against the bureaucracy. And if you'd had a different political context, then you would have had different consequences. I mean, but you still have like certain fundamental problems. For example, when you're talking about industrializing poor and backward countries like the Soviet Union in the 1920s or Poland in the 40s, yes, Polish workers who are see themselves as exploited by a state that's not democratic, view the management as similar to capitalist management. But really, the process of what's going on is different. I mean, really, it's not that many of the measures that the bureaucrats had to take were just dictated by necessity. And there's a certain kind of unreality in the discussion because it's precisely. I mean, the paradox of Poland is that it's precisely because the workers felt that they had no management in running the society, that they had this kind of class consciousness of themselves, but felt that they didn't run the society, that it wasn't theirs, even though there wasn't an actual bourgeoisie, that they were able to regard the bureaucracy as being like the bourgeoisie. And in some respects, the bureaucracy kind of acted the way a bourgeoisie would act. For example, like in the 40s, it pitted like fresh peasants in from the countryside against seasoned and more suspicious, more sophisticated workers, and it did so to render the workers politically passive in order to manage them. And yes, that seems like the kind of process you have under capitalism, but it really has a different economic logic. It's just like this is bringing up the analogy of Israel and South Africa. It's like there are lots of things in the occupied territories that remind you of South Africa. There are lots of things in like Stalinist dictatorships that remind you of fascism, but they have a different sociological logic. And I think that has to be pointed out. And I think Trotsky was very aware of that, and he was more aware of it than people like Shachtman, because he'd been in power in the Soviet Union. He'd been on both sides. He didn't sort of see the bureaucracy as always the enemy. I mean, he knew in some sense that a revolution would still face these problems. I mean, even under the best circumstances, in the United States, you still face problems of planning and management.
So Nick had a couple questions. Nick from Washington, D.C. The first one was, I'm going to give them both to you. The first one was, can you try and explain this through analogy to contemporary China, which seems to orient its growth exclusively for the world market? And then the second one was, the distinction you're making seems to privilege formal democracy as a category for socialism, as opposed to a political regime oriented to eliminating the necessity for work. This was privileged. Formal democracy was privileged also in how you express the three factors used to describe socialism, which neglected to prioritize this orientation. This is sort of a Postonian point, sits without such an orientation. Stalinism/capitalism will continue to reproduce the necessity of work, no matter what the level of development of the means of production, unconsciously.
Okay, first of all, I think that the necessity of work is based on like physical realities. I mean, it's not in the short run an immediate political problem. I mean, if you have a society where there is sufficient abundance, then people won't have to work. That's a technical issue, not basically at this point a political issue. I don't think
the United States has a sufficient abundance for people not to work as much as they do.
In the transition to socialism.
Well, they wouldn't have to work as much as they do, but they'd still have to work. I mean, if you had a completely automated planet, I mean, that's again. So I don't think that the question of like the necessity of people to work is a product of of Stalinism. I mean, in Stalinism, people had to work because the economy had to function, and in that sense, work was a physically imposed necessity, and it would have been even under a democratic workers' regime, given the level of production. The question of privileging formal democracy, I'm not privileging formal democracy, I'm laying out the contradictions that existed. I mean, a lot of Trotskyists or people from a Trotskyist tradition took the opposite pose. I mean, this is where Pabloism comes. It's like, yeah, Stalinism's progressive. It's abolished private property. It's like, yeah, it's not democratic, but it's still some kind of reform we can support. I mean, I don't think that I'm privileging formal democracy. I mean, I'm just sort of outlining the facts. I mean, if you say was privileging formal democracy, say that the only places that Trotskyists could function openly were in bourgeois, democratic, imperialist societies, it's just a fact. Now, the Trotskyists tried to ignore that. I mean, they didn't say, well, yeah, we need democracy to function. I mean, because they denounced their democratic imperialism as just as imperialist as Nazi Germany, and they said they supported Stalinism against formal democracy. I mean,
But let me just put Nick's question. He didn't say this, but this is my sense of his question, which is that sort of fourth on your list, your list of three that Pam brought up, the problem of authority and of exploitation and of democracy. There also should be sort of the problem of work, or the problem of like the necessity of labor in society.
Well, I spoke about that in terms of like a sense of like an absolute notion of human freedom, of creating a society of each according to his needs
Right,
and so
the
forth.
transformation would run into these problems.
Right, but what is presupposed in creating such a society is a society where, yes, people still have to work, but where there isn't poverty, there isn't class exploitation, and there is genuine workers' democracy. And so far, no one has even created that intermediate stage. So the first question would be, well, how do we get to the intermediate stage? And then the question would be, well, how do we get from the intermediate stage to a society of genuine human freedom? Because if we could get to the intermediate stage, we'd be doing pretty well, it would seem to me.
So there are two other questions. So let me do Emmanuel's question here. Emmanuel's from Boston. Did anyone from a Trotskyist tradition ever attempt to, in your view, adequately explain how banality enabled Stalinism to thrive and the sort of deactivation of the working class you talked about?
You know, Trotskyists didn't go that much into sociology, certainly not the sociology of Stalinism. I mean, there's some interesting work, but not by people, as far as I know, from a Trotskyist. There's a book called, like, Ordinary Stalinism.
Everyday Stalinism.
Everyday,
Sheila
Fitzpatrick, Everyday Stalinism. You know, so I mean, and particularly during this period, I mean, a lot of Trotskyists, when they were confronting Stalinists, wanted to emphasize the most brutal, oppressive aspects of Stalinism. And just as Trotskyists overemphasized the class consciousness of workers in the West, they massively overestimated the class consciousness of workers in the East and their political initiative. So just, you know, that was part of what went along with Trotskyism. Say, well, yeah, workers are just fundamentally submitting to capitalism, and Stalinism wasn't like the point that Trotskyists wanted to make. But that goes to the general question of revolutionary optimism.
Then I had one brief.
So the question is, sure, does that justify
Yeah, I think this is just a longer continuation of the question of the work week. But I feel like we don't have much more time, and I have a different question.
Okay.
Can I come in? My brief question is just that it seems to me that a lot of what you were talking about today, in the James Cannon piece that was on the reading list, he talks about, you know, the reason we have to come up with these theses for the Fourth International is because there are revisionists who are arguing against our most basic proposition that now is the epoch of revolutions.
Yeah.
And that, you know, the revisionists want to say it's no longer such. Empirically, the revisionists obviously were broadly right? That, I mean, maybe you could say China and Cuba or whatever, but broadly.
After World War II, there was a political stabilization in Europe, both East and West, throughout the developed capitalist world, and the only place that people tended to see revolutions was, with maybe some brief exceptions like May 68 or Portugal in 74 or something, was in the Third World. But then
does that mean to be a Marxist and to be political in the West mean necessarily you have to be deluded?
No. I mean, again, like, the fundamental question remains the same, which is that as long as you believe in both the necessity and possibility of a revolution in the advanced capitalist West on a worldwide basis of socialism, then the fundamental political task remains the same. I mean, the problem with those theses is that they substitute wish fulfillment and political criteria for analysis. I mean, that's why I brought up, you know, the SPART point. It's true, Goldman and Morrow represented a right-wing political appetite. So you can say, well, the SWP majority were politically more correct. But the facts were on the other side. I mean, at some point you have to acknowledge that. So I don't know, maybe it's true that like a certain type of orthodoxy keeps people correct. That's what I said. I don't know. Maybe dogmatism does make people smarter under certain circumstances. I mean, I don't mean to dismiss Cannon as a dogmatist. I'm being facetious, but there's a fundamental tension that one notices in the Trotskyist movement, but, you know, particularly at this period. This period is the most extreme divergence between the rhetoric of the analysis and the reality. It was better under Trotsky in the 30s, and it became better later on.
We've gone a little farther than 3:30, so we'll start the discussion here in New York. But is there anything that needs to be said right at the end, or I think we're going to close off here? And thank you, Richard, for your
I just
lecture.
wanted to comment, since I see this comment
Yes.
from Chris. And I mean, the point about an 80-hour work week is, is an 80-hour work week justified under socialism? I mean, the question is, well, suppose you had a genuine workers' democracy and the workers voted themselves to work 80 hours a week in order to build rapid industrialization. So I mean, it's the real question is not work. The real question is political consciousness of the workers and democracy, and those are obviously linked.
Okay, thanks everyone from all our cities. Be seeing you soon. Have a wonderful discussion. Things will be posted at the end of the day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, my question was just going to
Can we
Can
take a
we
break?
Yeah.
You go first, Ross.
You can ask your question and then.
Ask the question and then we'll take
Your
You're just
Google Chrome
asking.
does doing weird things with the mouse. Your Chrome is doing weird things.
What do you mean?
It goes to the side and
No,
Can I
that's
show
not
you
the
something
problem.
funny?
I have hot
So
corners.
I bought this
installed.
book
So-
just for
and then the
$20
mouse disappears.
on
Like
the
the
internet,
mouse. I can't move the mouse.
and it's like some, just because I wanted to copy it. So it's a biography by Herbert, French and Trotsky. But in it, in front flat, I see an inscription: "To how great fighter and author of so useful and wonderful books."
Isn't that amazing?
From Pierre Brouet.
Oh my god. Holy shit. Holy shit. It's by the author.
It's by the author. It's
To how
great.
great.
It's great, and it was from a library.